The tape hissed like breath escaping from something buried too long. In the basement of a Chicago archive, beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying flies, a sound engineer pressed play on a 1936 recording. The needle found its groove, static, crackling. Then Robert Johnson's voice emerged from 7 decades of silence. But there was something else there, something underneath. Something that made the engineer's hand freeze above the stop button, his mouth going dry as the Mississippi in August. They say when you listen to the devil's music long enough, you start to hear things that aren't supposed to be there. Or maybe things that were always there, waiting. In 1936, in a makeshift recording studio in San Antonio, Texas, Robert Johnson walked in alone and walked out a legend. 29 songs captured on shellac discs. 29 pieces of his soul pressed into wax. For decades, people listened to those recordings and heard genius. They heard the birth of rock and roll. They heard a man who could make a guitar weep and wail like it had its own beating heart. But few ever listened deeply enough. Few ever wondered what else might be trapped in those grooves. Before we walk deeper into this mystery, if you want to follow the stories of souls who touched the impossible, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because here at Soul Chronicles, every legend hides a truth that time tried to bury. Drop a comment and tell me which blues mystery you want uncovered next, because some secrets only reveal themselves to those willing to listen. The year was 2003. Digital restoration technology had reached a point where archivists could strip away layers of surface noise from old recordings, revealing details that had been hidden for generations. The Smithsonian had launched a project to restore the complete works of Robert Johnson. Those 29 songs that had influenced everyone from Muddy Waters to Eric Clapton, from the Rolling Stones to Led Zeppelin. Dr. Richard Collins was the lead audio engineer on the project, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses that perpetually hung around his neck on a beaded chain. He'd spent 30 years working with vintage recordings, had restored Bessie Smith, had cleaned up Charlie Patton, had brought new life to scratchy recordings of work songs and field hollers that dated back to the turn of the century. He thought he'd heard everything. The Restoration Lab was located in a converted warehouse on Chicago's South Side. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens glowing blue in the dim light. Dr. Collins preferred to work at night, when the building was quiet and the only sounds were the hum of hard drives and the occasional rattle of elevated trains passing in the distance. He started with Crossroad Blues, the iconic song, the one that had spawned 1,000 legends about midnight deals and unholy bargains. He'd heard it hundreds of times before, could sing every word, could play the guitar line in his sleep. But he'd never heard it like this. The software worked by analyzing the waveform, identifying patterns that represented noise, separating signal from interference. As the algorithm did its work, stripping away decades of hiss and crackle, the music emerged with startling clarity. Johnson's guitar, bright and immediate, as if he were sitting in the room, the stomp of his foot keeping time, the creak of the chair he sat on. And then, underneath it all, something else. Dr. Collins leaned forward, his face inches from the monitor. He isolated the frequency range, boosted it, filtered out everything else. There, a low humming sound, almost subsonic. Not the kind of noise you'd expect from electrical interference or mechanical rumble. This was rhythmic, pulsing, like a heartbeat but not quite, like breathing but deeper, slower. He played the section again and again. Each time the sound was there, woven through the entire recording like a thread of darkness through bright cloth. His hands were shaking as he reached for his notebook. Over the next 3 nights, Dr. Collins worked through the entire Johnson catalog. Come On in My Kitchen, Hellhound on My Trail, Me and the Devil Blues, Love in Vain. Song after song, the same anomaly appeared, that low, rhythmic pulse, present in every single recording, always at the same relative frequency, always maintaining the same relationship to Johnson's voice. The strange thing was its consistency. In studio recordings from the 1930s, background noise was common. Vibrations from passing trucks, electrical hum from power lines, the sound of other musicians in adjacent rooms. But those noises were random, environmental. This was different. This followed the music, rose and fell with the emotion of the performance. Intensified during the most powerful moments, the parts where Johnson's voice seemed to reach beyond mere singing into something ancient and primal. Dr. Collins called a colleague, an audio forensics expert named Marcus Webb, who worked for the FBI analyzing audio evidence in criminal cases. They met at a diner on 63rd Street, a 24-hour place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that could strip paint. Dr. Collins slid his laptop across the table. "Listen to this," he said. "Tell me what you hear." Marcus put on headphones, closed his eyes. The diner noise faded around them. A trucker argued with the waitress about his bill. A drunk mumbled to himself in a corner booth. The cook scraped the griddle with a metal spatula. Marcus's eyes opened. "Where did you get this?" "Robert Johnson, original 1936 recordings." "That's not possible." "Which part?" Marcus pulled off the headphones, ran a hand over his shaved head. "I've heard this sound before, or something like it. We encountered it in a case 3 years ago. A kidnapping. The perp called from an abandoned factory, made ransom demands. When we analyzed the call, we found this same low-frequency pulsing underneath his voice. Our team spent weeks trying to identify the source." "What was it?" "We never figured it out. The theory was some kind of industrial equipment, maybe ventilation systems, with a specific harmonic resonance. But here's the thing. The factory where he called from had been closed for 20 years. No power, no equipment running. Nothing that could have made that sound." Dr. Collins felt cold despite the overheated diner. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that whatever this is, it's not environmental noise. It's not a recording artifact. It's something else." Marcus paused. "And if it's on Robert Johnson's recordings from 1936, then it's been there a hell of a lot longer than 3 years. The recordings had been made in 2 sessions. The first in San Antonio, Texas, in November 1936, in a makeshift studio on the 2nd floor of the Gunter Hotel. The second in Dallas, in June 1937, in a temporary setup in a building on Elm Street. 2 different locations, 2 different recording setups, different microphones, different equipment, different engineers. Yet the anomaly appeared in both sessions, unchanged. Dr. Collins began researching the technical specifications of 1930s recording technology. The equipment was primitive by modern standards. Single microphones, direct-to-disc recording, no possibility of overdubs or post-production. What went onto the wax was what happened in the room at that moment. Nothing more, nothing less. Which meant that whatever was creating that sound, it was physically present during the recording sessions. In the room with Robert Johnson, he found the testimony of Don Law, the producer who had overseen both sessions. Law had described Johnson as shy, nervous, unwilling to perform, facing the engineers or other musicians. At the San Antonio session, Johnson had insisted on facing the corner of the room, playing with his back to everyone else. He seemed to be playing for someone who wasn't there. Law had written in a letter years later, like he was reporting to some invisible audience, seeking approval from empty air. At the Dallas session, witnesses reported similar behavior. Johnson would pause between takes, turn his head as if listening to someone speak, then nod and continue. When asked what he was doing, he'd smile that crooked smile and say, "Just checking with my advisor." No one thought much of it at the time. Musicians were known for their superstitions, their rituals, their peculiar ways. But now, 7 decades later, with technology that could peel back the layers of sound like skin from bone, Dr. Collins wondered what exactly Johnson had been listening to. He decided to do something unconventional. He took the isolated low-frequency sound and reversed it, a technique sometimes used in audio forensics to reveal hidden patterns or masked speech. Then he ran it through a frequency analysis, mapping the pulses against known patterns of human vocalization. The results appeared on his screen at 3:47 in the morning. The pattern matched human speech. Not exactly, not perfectly, but close enough. The rises and falls, the rhythmic variations, they corresponded to the cadence of someone talking, or more accurately, someone whispering. Long, slow phrases spoken so low that they existed more as vibration than sound. Dr. Collins sat back in his chair, his heart hammering. He looked around the empty lab, at the shadows in the corners, at the dark windows reflecting his pale face. The building creaked. The hard drives hummed. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. He thought about Robert Johnson standing in that hotel room in San Antonio, facing the corner, playing for an audience of one. He thought about the stories, the legends, the myth of the Crossroads deal. A young man desperate to play guitar, meeting a tall man in black at midnight where two dirt roads intersected, a deal struck, a soul sold, instant mastery granted. Everyone had always assumed it was just a metaphor, a way of explaining inexplicable talent, a narrative to make sense of genius that seemed to come from nowhere. But what if it wasn't a metaphor? What if something had actually happened at that crossroads? And what if it hadn't ended there? Dr. Collins pulled up Me and the Devil Blues, the song where Johnson sang about Satan knocking at his door, about evil spirits moving through his house. He isolated the anomaly, boosted its amplitude, and played it through the studio monitors at high volume. The sound filled the room, low, resonant, almost felt more than heard. It vibrated in his chest, made his teeth ache, caused a pressure behind his eyes like the onset of a migraine. And underneath all that, if he listened very carefully, if he let himself fall into the sound rather than just hearing it, there were almost words, almost phrases. A voice speaking in a language that predated language, that existed in the space between meaning and sound. He killed the playback, sat in the sudden silence, breathing hard. The question burned in his mind, was this voice speaking to Johnson or through him? He needed to know more about the recording sessions themselves. He drove to the university library, spent hours in the archives going through old newspapers, trade journals, anything that mentioned Robert Johnson or the recording dates. Most of it was routine, a young blues singer, one of dozens passing through the region, making records for a small label. No fanfare, no indication that anything unusual had occurred. But then he found something. A brief mention in a San Antonio newspaper dated November 28, 1936, the day after Johnson's first recording session. Local residents reported strange atmospheric disturbances in the vicinity of the Gunter Hotel yesterday evening. Several witnesses described a feeling of unease and a low humming sound that persisted for approximately 40 minutes. The source of the disturbance could not be determined. Police investigated and found no cause for concern. 40 minutes, approximately the length of a recording session. Dr. Collins felt something cold crawl down his spine. He found similar reports from Dallas, June 1937. Brief mentions of electrical disturbances, of lights flickering in the neighborhood around the recording location, of dogs barking in unison at something unseen. It was as if the very act of Robert Johnson, playing guitar and singing, created some kind of disturbance in the local environment. As if his music opened something, or attracted something, or gave voice to something that was already there, waiting to be heard. Dr. Collins returned to his lab. He needed to take this further, needed to understand not just what the sound was, but what it meant. He began comparing the intensity of the anomaly across different songs, charting it against the emotional content of the lyrics and the complexity of the guitar playing. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. The anomaly was strongest on the songs that dealt most directly with supernatural themes. Me and the Devil Blues, Hellhound on My Trail, Crossroad Blues. On these tracks, the underlying pulse was almost as loud as Johnson's voice, present throughout every verse, every chorus, every guitar solo. On more conventional songs, love songs, songs about traveling or drinking or relationships, the anomaly was still present but muted, as if whatever was creating it was less interested, less engaged. It was as if something was listening to Robert Johnson sing and responding. Dr. Collins tried to tell himself there was a rational explanation, some acoustic phenomenon, some quirk of the recording equipment, some physical law he didn't understand. But late at night, alone in the lab, with those recordings playing, with that low pulse filling the darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was hearing something that wasn't meant to be heard, that the digital restoration hadn't just revealed a technical anomaly, but had uncovered something that time and technology had mercifully obscured. He began having dreams. In them, he stood in a dimly lit room with yellowed wallpaper and a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Robert Johnson sat in the corner, his back to the room, playing guitar. The music was beautiful and terrible, each note perfect and each note wrong, as if beauty and damnation were the same thing. And in the corner opposite Johnson, barely visible in the shadows, stood a tall figure, perfectly still, watching, listening, the source of that low, rhythmic pulse that vibrated through everything. Dr. Collins would wake from these dreams with his heart racing, his sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of dust and ashes in his mouth. He tried to talk to colleagues about what he'd found, but no one wanted to listen. They dismissed it as audio artifacts, as confirmation bias, as the result of spending too many hours staring at waveforms and hearing patterns that weren't there. "You're listening to the blues, Richard," one colleague told him. "It's supposed to sound haunted. That's the whole point." But Dr. Collins knew better. He'd worked with thousands of recordings. He knew the difference between atmospheric music and actual atmosphere, between the illusion of presence and presence itself. He decided to do one final analysis. He took the isolated anomaly from every single Robert Johnson recording and layered them together, synchronizing them, combining them into a single track. 29 recordings, 29 instances of that low, pulsing voice. He played the result through the studio monitors. What emerged was undeniable. Words, or something like words. A voice speaking in phrases that almost made sense, that existed on the edge of comprehension. The cadence was wrong for English, wrong for any language Dr. Collins recognized, but it was definitely speech, definitely intentional, definitely directed at something or someone. He recorded the output, burned it to a CD, and took it to a linguistics professor at the university, a specialist in dead languages and obscure dialects. The professor listened once, listened again, then looked at Dr. Collins with an expression that mixed fascination and fear. "Where did you get this?" Dr. Collins explained about the Robert Johnson recordings, about the digital restoration, about the anomaly underneath the music. The professor was quiet for a long time. Then, the rhythm, the intonation, it's consistent with what we call ecstatic speech, the kind of vocalization associated with religious trance states, with possession, with certain forms of ritual magic. It appears in cultures all over the world. Ancient Sumerian priests used it. Medieval mystics described it. It shows up in voodoo ceremonies, in shamanic practices, in early Christian glossolalia. What does it mean? That's the thing. It doesn't mean anything. It's not about semantic content. It's about the act itself, the speaking. Ecstatic speech isn't meant to convey information. It's meant to create an opening, to establish a connection, to invite something in. Invite what? The professor handed back the CD. That depends on who you ask. Some would say God, some would say the divine, some would say the unconscious mind, and some, he paused, some would say something much older and much less interested in our well-being. Dr. Collins left the university and drove aimlessly through the city, the CD sitting on the passenger seat like something radioactive. Evening fell, streetlights flickered on, and the world transformed into that liminal space between day and night, between seen and unseen. He thought about Robert Johnson dying at age 27, poisoned by a jealous husband, dying in agony over 3 days, his body racked with convulsions, crying out in his delirium about hellhounds and devils. He thought about how Johnson's music had influenced generations, how it had shaped the course of popular music, how it had been the seed from which rock and roll had grown. What had been planted in those recordings? What had been passed on, generation to generation, musician to musician, listener to listener? And was it still there, waiting in the grooves, waiting in the digital files, waiting to be heard by anyone who listened deeply enough? He returned to the lab one last time. He made copies of his analysis, backed everything up to external drives, wrote detailed notes about his methodology and findings. Then he archived the project and walked away. The Smithsonian released the restored Robert Johnson recordings 6 months later. Critics praised the clarity, the revelatory detail, the way the digital restoration had brought new life to these historical treasures. Millions of people downloaded the files, listened through earbuds and expensive speakers, heard every note and every nuance. And underneath it all, unnoticed by most, that low pulse continued. That voice continued to speak. That invitation remained open. Dr. Collins never publicly discussed what he'd found. When asked about the restoration project, he'd smile politely and talk about technical specifications, about the challenges of working with deteriorated source material, about the satisfaction of bringing clarity to historical recordings. But sometimes, late at night, he'd wake from those dreams of the hotel room, of Robert Johnson facing the corner, of that tall figure standing in the shadows. And he'd remember what the linguistics professor had told him about ecstatic speech, about creating openings, about invitations. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Some deals, once made, echo forward through time. Some voices, once given permission to speak, never stop speaking. The recordings are still out there, available on every streaming platform, downloadable with a click, listenable by anyone with ears and an internet connection. The music is brilliant. The guitar playing is revolutionary. The lyrics are poetry. And underneath it all, if you know how to listen, if you have the right equipment and the wrong kind of curiosity, you can still hear it. That low, rhythmic pulse. That voice speaking words that aren't words. That invitation extended 7 decades ago and never withdrawn. Robert Johnson sang about crossroads and devils, about hellhounds and bargains, about prices paid and prices yet to come due. People thought he was singing metaphorically, expressing the blues experience through supernatural imagery. But maybe he was simply reporting what he saw, what he heard, what he carried with him from that crossroads to those recording sessions and beyond. Maybe the devil's music isn't called that because it sounds wicked. Maybe it's called that because the devil himself is in the recording, captured in the technology, preserved in the medium, waiting with infinite patience for anyone who listens deeply enough. Dr. Collins doesn't listen to blues music anymore. Hasn't for years. He works on other projects now, restores other artists, stays in safer sonic territory. But sometimes, walking through the city at night, he'll pass a bar or a club and hear someone playing guitar, playing those familiar licks, those Johnson-influenced runs and turnarounds that have become the foundation of modern music. And underneath it all, felt more than heard, that low pulse continues, that voice continues to speak. That invitation remains open to anyone willing to play that music, to channel that power, to stand at that crossroads between genius and damnation and choose to cross over. The question isn't whether Robert Johnson made a deal. The question is whether that deal ended with him, or whether it's still being honored note by note, listener by listener, soul by soul. Before you go, if this story made your spine tingle, hit that like button and subscribe to Soul Chronicles, because some mysteries are meant to be explored, some voices are meant to be heard, and some truths hide in the spaces between the notes. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you sacrifice for absolute talent? Because in the world of the blues, every gift has its price, and every price has its due. The tape hisses, the needle finds its groove, and in the silence between the notes, something waits, something listens, something speaks in a voice too low to hear but impossible to ignore. Maybe it's always been there, maybe it always will be. Maybe that's the real blues, not the music you hear, but the music that hears you and never lets you go.